Good Monday morning. Today we are continuing our journey on unit testing in JavaScript. In the last episode that you can find in the episode description, we explored the why behind unit testing. And the why is to keep the complexity of our code from overwhelming us. Today though, we are going to focus a little bit more on what unit testing is and how it helps with managing complexity. I am MPJ, and you are watching Fun Function. Last week we wrote some code. Order total, the function order total. Order total was a function that took a piece of data, an order, and grabbed all the items in the order and summarized them for us in an order total. Today we're going to write that same function, but we are instead going to do it with a test-first approach. I also want to state for the record that today I am enormously tired. It's just one of those days where the caffeine doesn't work. Let's do some coding and see if we can get some energy today. Alright, here on line 1, we call order total with an order. And you recognize the sample data from the last episode. And here we check if the order total, returned from order total, isn't 808. We throw an error, check fail. By happy path here, I mean the standard case where everything goes well, there's no weird edge cases or anything. It's just the main thing that the function is supposed to do. Alright, so there's no actual code here. Order total here, it does not exist yet. We wrote the test first. Can I just be the devil's advocate and ask why we are doing it this way? Why are we writing the test first instead of writing the code first and then adding a test later? Well, the biggest benefit with test first for me is that it helps ensure that I actually write the tests at all. I find that if I start adding tests after I've written the code, if I try to do that, I tend to slack on that, and the reason why I slack on that is that it's just harder to write tests afterwards than before. And the reason why it's harder is that it's hard to figure out what tests to write. Okay, can you give an example? Okay, maybe. Can you give an example of that? Okay. Let's have a look at the code from the last episode. No. How do I increase the font size? Zoom in. Okay, fantastic. Okay, so this is only 8 lines of code. But even just at 8 lines, we already have multiple use cases in the code. And now, since we didn't add the tests while we were writing them, I have to now, after the fact, analyze the code and archaeology those out. Okay, but is that really all that hard? No, it's not. It's not rocket surgery by any means, but it is busy work that we can avoid. Adding tests after the fact to me is like adding an extra unnecessary archaeology step where we try to extract things from our own code. If I try to make an analogy, and it's an analogy so it's not perfect, but it feels a little bit like if, let's say that we were a chef and we were inventing a new recipe. We were just playing around and adding things to the soup, and eventually, like, the soup turned out really well. And then it's time to write the recipe down so that non-cooks could do it. And as we didn't really keep tabs on what ingredients we put into the soup, we now have to like look in the soup and like after the fact try to figure out which ingredients we put in there, like poke around in it. And that would sort of work. We might miss an ingredient there and might take a little bit more time, but it would work. But to me, it seems like it would have been more sensible to make notes of what we added to the soup as we did it. That, to me, seems more effective and reliable. All right, fair enough. Let's go back to the original code. Okay, we are doing test first today, which means that we only write code when there exists a test that requires that code to exist. I think I'm lisping a bit today. So in this case here, we see that order total does not exist. That's a very obvious problem. One part about unit testing is that you constantly try to put yourself in these situations where the next step becomes obvious. All right, function order total. All right, now it fails for another reason. That's good progress. Again, unit testing is about making these small, very incremental steps of progress towards a goal. We create this very nice feedback loop for our work. It's almost a little bit like a game where when you hop on an enemy, like that gives you a satisfying bloop when you like the Goomba goes away and dies. And now, like getting to a new level in a video game, we have a new challenge, which is that this check here, this fails, the happy path check fails because this is not 808, because this is an empty function and is returning undefined. So again, let's remember that when we are doing test first, we try to always only write code that is required by a test to pass. So the first impulse here might be to start writing a reduce, like order items reduce, but that's not actually what the test requires. If we are being really strict about the rule of only writing code that tests require, we could do return 808 and the test succeeds. What the fuck shit? What is it? This feels so unintuitive to me. Yes! This is, if you do test first by the book and really take it to its logical conclusion, this is what you end up with. Like, this is a very common situation. Weird! You are weird! Alright, so you really need to explain this to me. Okay, we have the test passing now, but the code is obviously wrong. How do we proceed from here? Alright, so there are 3 different approaches that you can take when you are writing test first. You can use obvious implementation, fake it till you make it, or triangulation. And these techniques, they go from orthodox to more chill. Let's talk about triangulation first, because that is the most conservative way of doing test-driven development. Okay, triangulation, what does that mean exactly? Is triangulation that thing you do with points on a map and you figure out where something is based on 3 points? Yeah, exactly, that's where the name comes from. And it's kind of similar in unit testing because often you find yourself in this situation where one test is not quite enough to drive the implementation. So let's actually write another test. I'm just going to copy, paste this. And I'm going to do like dragon color. And we're going to set that price to 20. And we're going to do dragon shoe toy. And I'm going to set that price to 40 perhaps. And I'm going to name this case happy path 2, and I'm going to name this 1. Perhaps example 1. Example 2. And this is supposed to be 60. I'm doing the math in my head. And now we have this second test here that is failing, which will cause us to actually have to write some code. So let's do that. Are you getting this with the whole red-green cycle going on in test-driven, in test first, that you, oh, it's red and you get sad, and then you write some code, and then you it gets green and you go happy again, and then it's red and you get sad, and yeah, they're getting it. Also, I would like to state for the record that this feels really weird. I think I get it though. I can see value with triangulation. Yeah, I think this feels safe. It feels like because it feels like it's hard to make mistakes with this. And it also has this quality of making it obvious what to do. Exactly. Get to green at all costs. Just focus on what code you need to write in order to make the test pass, and then look at the code and try to figure out what it is that we need to add, and then add a test for that, and then the loop continues again. Red, green, red, green, red, green. However, I would like to stress that triangulation is not the only way of doing test first. We could also have gone immediately for the obvious implementation once we had the first test, and just written this reduce function out, because it's still kind of obvious that that is what we are going for. We could also have taken a middle road, which is fake it till you make it. And that is kind of, yeah, that's in between. So what we would have done there is that we would still have first gotten to green as fast as possible by just writing the hard-coded value in 808. But then we would have immediately replaced it with the actual implementation. So you kind of, it's kind of in between. All of these are absolutely test first techniques, but they are differing in their orthodoxness. If you are a beginner, it might be good to stick with triangulation for a little while, because it's the simplest one. It's the one that is most pure to test first, and it will be the technique that most gives you a feel for test first as something to integrate in your workflow. And then once you get the hang of it, you can start like dumping into these more relaxed approaches sometimes. Okay, now that the initial weirdness feel has died down, I think I kind of like triangulation though, emotionally, conceptually. I can see it being a bit slow to work with, a bit slower, a bit more calmly paced, but it does have this huge benefit of giving me an obvious way forward all the time. That seems very calming to me. I can see myself jumping between these actually, but falling back to triangulation on days where I have more complicated problems, or perhaps on days where I'm, feeling a little bit lazy, or just having a down day and I have a hard time thinking. Then triangulation could kind of keep me from doing these long thought jumps in my head, and just keep me focused on the red, green, red, green, red, green loop. All right, let's add another test. Let's add quantity support. right, so this test that we just wrote, the quantity test, now works because we added code for that. However, these tests here, they have failed, and this have failed as well. We just don't see it because this throws the error first, but this would also fail because these things have no quantity in them, and our code now expect this. We made a breaking change. Okay, yeah, I get what this is. We have changed the API of our code, and we have tests in place to verify that API, which means that we now have to change all our tests. I feel like this is giving us extra work fixing these tests, and this feels like work that wouldn't exist if we didn't have the unit test in place. You're kind of sort of right, but you're also kind of sort of wrong. You need to have a little bit of imagination. In this particular case, this is mostly just extra work, but that is true only because we don't yet have any external code that is making use of our order total. Our test did break because we actually made a change to a breaking change to the API of order total. If order total had been in like some library that was used by thousands of users, you couldn't make a change like this without doing like a major version bump and announcing it to all the users, because they might have code that relies on that the API follows a certain contract, and that is what unit tests verify. So if order total had been in use for a while before we added the quantity support, then the unit test breakage here would actually have highlighted a very real problem. You know what? I was about to change these two tests here and just add quantity 1 to them, but I think that we should pretend that code in the system is consuming this, and perhaps even third-party code in other libraries, because it's not unreasonable to think that something like order total might be very useful for many systems, and that you might want to change this logic, or share this logic, sorry. So let's actually make sure that both cases work. So I'm gonna quantity 0 there. Does that work? I think I have to put that in parents. Oh, no, it can't be 0. It needs to be 1. And yeah, this works now. Observing this code, it feels like we are baking in a bit much in the happy path examples now here. It feels like these are not actually testing the happy path now. They are testing the happy path and lack of quantity, the lack of quantity case. So what I'm actually gonna do is that I'm going to create a dedicated happy path case. Now that we have this check for no quantity specified, we can safely extend these happy path examples to be actually focused on, well, you know, the happy path. So as you see here, we keep the tests very small and focused on one thing only. So you see here that this test, for instance, there's a lot of things that this test does not test. It doesn't test, it only has one item, so it's not concerned with many items, and it also tests only the quantity case, like having no quantity case, like the implied quantity case that is only this test is only concerned with that. The happy path test, it happens to test a little bit more, but these tests are, I use the happy path test mainly to get me going, to get started, and the happy path, it's okay that it tests a little bit more than one thing. But overall, unit testing, it refers to like order total as a unit that we can test in isolation. That's one way of interpreting the unit word in unit testing, but it's also important that each test is a unit, that it doesn't like test hog tons of code or hog tons of cases in one test. That becomes really hard to deal with when multiple things start breaking. It's much nicer to have each unit test be a unit. In this episode, I also focused a lot on the benefit of that unit tests have on, or test-driven development or test-first has on dealing with complexity. But I want to make a segue here and also note that unit test also works as a communication channel, a really good communication channel to your future selves or your colleague. Because these tests basically double as very specific and very nice executable documentation for your code. Normal documentation with, examples and stuff, that is also very nice, but unit tests are a very good supplement to normal documentation because they get really into the nitty-gritty of how exactly a function works. Okay, so what about test runners? I've heard about Mocha and Jest and Jasmine and whatever. We have not used them here. We have just done these very hand-coded, handcrafted checks. Yeah, I have actually avoided introducing a test runner at this stage because I want you as a viewer to learn as few things as possible at the same time. If we introduce a test runner, you would have to learn a test runner while also learning the basic principles of test first and unit testing, and it just feels like we can introduce things sequentially. But test runners is what we are going to talk about in the next episode. Which brings me to that you have just watched an episode of Fun Function. I release these every Monday morning, 0800 GMT. If you are watching from the future, you can check out next week's episode here. Otherwise, you can subscribe here so that you don't miss it. If you are forgetful, you can also turn on notifications in the YouTube app. I am MPJ. Until next Monday morning, stay tuned.